Welcome to the STEM Talk. In just 30 minutes each month, join experts from across the STEM landscape as they provide factual information, practical strategies, and actionable resources to help you navigate the ever-changing world of STEM education, workforce development, policy, and advocacy. Hosted by the After School STEM Hub, STEM Education Coalition, and STEM Ecosystems, the STEM Talk creates a safe space for dialogue while maintaining a focus on information that matters to you and the community that you serve. Welcome to the STEM Talk, Episode 11, STEM Signals. Hi, my name is Jenny Frank, and I am the Director of the STEM Ecosystems Initiative at TIES. This month, we're reading the signals, and there are several worth your attention. FY 2026 appropriations are mostly wrapped up, and most of the STEM programs came through with level funding. That's good news. But NSF is still without a director, navigating staff shortages, and hasn't quite figured out how they're going to spend that money. Meanwhile, Congress has already moved on to FY 2027, and that means the advocacy window is open right now. And beyond appropriations, there are other developments such as AI literacy, NSF consolidation, and a new NASA workforce funding opportunity that you'll want to know about. Joining me today are James Brown from the STEM Education Coalition, Della Cronin from Bose Public Affairs, and Leslie Brooks from the After School Alliance. Let's get into it.
Nice to see you on this March morning. For those of you who live in and around DC, you know it's getting busy on Capitol Hill, where, as you can see, James is this very second. Given the recent events, there's some big picture setting that we want to do for you. As Jenny said, we continue to be stuck on FY 26 appropriations, not only because of a partial government shutdown, but also because what does it mean now that the bills that we have been watching so closely have passed? What the State of the Union and the FY 27 appropriations action is sort of telling us so far, and then some other announcements and developments that we think you'll find interesting. To start it off, I will turn it over to James to talk about the big picture, storm clouds and sunlight ahead at the same time. Given the recent events, there's some big picture setting that we want to do for you. As Jenny said, we continue to be stuck on FY 26 appropriations, not only because of a partial government shutdown, but also because what does it mean now that the bills that we have been watching so closely have passed? What the State of the Union and the FY 27 appropriations action is sort of telling us so far, and then some other announcements and developments that we think you'll find interesting. To start it off, I will turn it over to James to talk about the big picture, storm clouds and sunlight ahead at the same time.
Thank you, Della. So this picture of the Capitol building, the interpretation depends on which direction you think the weather is moving. Some people think the storm is heading our direction. Other people think the storm is receding. But there are a couple of things we definitely know for sure, which is, in March of an election year, the Congress is really starting to shift into election mode. Some of you may have seen there was a big primary in Texas where a number of incumbents were defeated, and they're sort of shaping up that as being one of the major races for the fall. In the House of Representatives, there's a very thin margin of Republican control in the House. There's been national redistricting going on this year, and there are about 18 swing seats, as they're called, in the House of Representatives. 14 of those are in Republican hands, 4 of those are in Democratic hands. So if there's sort of an even split in those races, you can expect the control of the House of Representatives to be up for grabs and probably switch to the Democratic side in November's elections. As Jenny mentioned, we're just starting to kick off the appropriations process for this year. All of the members of Congress are waiting for our presidential budget proposal to drop and submitting their proposals for appropriations projects to the committees in Congress that deal with that. And in general, in this year, you expect legislative action to wrap up relatively early so members can get back to their districts by August to campaign. So you've seen a markup of the Farm Bill this week. There are a few nominations that are being dealt with this week. The nomination for the NIST director is up this week, for example. And you can expect a lot of legislative action in the next maybe 6 weeks, and then things will start to slow down as we move into the summer.
Okay, so just to go back to some of the things that we've talked about on recent calls. FY26 appropriations update is still something we need to talk about. I suspect a lot of you know that the Homeland Security bill still hasn't been passed. There are talks of efforts to try to reopen that agency this week, maybe next week, but there isn't a real clear strategy for doing that as of right now. So the FY26 appropriations process continues to linger. But having said that, the bills that we were watching closely, namely the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Bill, as well as the Commerce, Justice, Science Bill, which funds the National Science Foundation, as well as a number of important research agencies, both were passed, and both passed at relatively level relatively level investments, which was good news given where the White House started last year and where the Republican Congress was. A reminder that most of the programs that we were advocating for were level funded in K-12 education. Title IV Part A, which is a program that can be used for STEM activities locally, was level funded. Preservation of the STEM Education Directorate was a victory for us. And then, as I mentioned, research programs and agencies were mostly level funded. But the open question is what now? Like the current fiscal year, which is FY26, is almost half over. These agencies are just getting these funding levels sent to them. What are they going to do between now and the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30, with this money? Over at the National Science Foundation, they don't have a director. One has been nominated, but he'll need to go through the nomination process, which will take some time. His name is Bill O'Neill. He was at HHS recently, and now he's going to go over to the National Science Foundation. But in the meantime, what's going to happen to the programs, the directorates that are over there? I think that's an open question, but we still have heard from folks in the know that even though the bill has been passed, it's going to take some time to decide which directorates are going to get what amount of money. And then after that, which programs are going to get what amount of money and how that money will be spent. They're also navigating staff shortages over there between the layoffs from last year and voluntary retirements. So there's a lot of open questions over at the National Science Foundation about what's going to happen with their investments. At the Department of Education, they're going to continue to implement the 9 interagency agreements, which move a fair number of their functions from that department to others, including the Labor Department, the Interior Department, the State Department, and the Health and Human Services Department. But the passage of the Labor, Health and Human Services Education Appropriations Bill did assert a certain level of oversight from Congress. They are expecting reports from the Department of Education on how that is going. And then the Department of Education will need to run some competitive grant programs that they sort of didn't in FY25. They need to do that in FY26. Presumably, they will do that in a way that embraces the priorities that they have announced as in this administration, which include things like school choice, returning education to the states, AI, and creating the workforce that transformational technology needs for the country. So that's what we're thinking about FY26. But FY27 is upon us. So the State of the Union was a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who watched it, it was long. It also didn't really address education in a way that we've grown used to from presidents. It talked mostly about the economy, immigration, border enforcement, other national policy issues. There were a couple of shout outs for issues that we're watching, the work that First Lady Melania Trump has done on AI and the AI challenge. Got a shout out from the president, as did the passage of the school choice education tax credit that was included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last year. President Trump celebrated what he considered the end of DEI in America. And then as a result of sort of the lack of information on education or research in his comments on that night, we are anxiously waiting for the White House budget request, which will include more detail on what the president and his administration is thinking about the programs that we all care about. But we don't know when that's coming. It's been delayed for a number of reasons. Most recently, it's been delayed because of what we've heard is a disagreement in the Office of Management and Budget about what to do regarding a request for significant increase in funding over at the Defense Department. So we're waiting just like you for the news on that.
Thanks, Della. So even though we don't have a budget request from the administration yet, members of Congress are starting to submit their appropriations requests for this current year. And one of the discussions is around which bills and which agencies will have congressionally directed spending requests. So in the past, the House has not had education earmarks. Looks like they're not going to do that again this year. But one of the trends that we've definitely seen is there are more congressionally directed spending requests in the last several cycles of appropriations bills. And we've seen a lot of those focus on STEM and educational facilities and laboratory equipment and things of that kind. So that's definitely a trend that's on the rise. And we've definitely tried to encourage people in the STEM community to start those conversations for this cycle. And if you haven't started for this cycle, it's about the right time to start thinking about next year's appropriations requests. That's one front that's pretty active. The other thing that's going on is there's a ton of hearings around artificial intelligence. All of the committees of jurisdiction. So, for example, in the House, that's the Education and Workforce Committee, the Science Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee that deals with health and other things, have held a whole bevy of hearings around artificial intelligence, the impacts on the workforce, the impacts on education, on higher education, on skilled trades and the like. So that's definitely a theme that members of Congress are trying to get their arms around. And it's a, for those of you who watch these technology-based hearings, it's pretty interesting theater if you haven't watched one, because some of the members are pretty savvy. They might have run tech companies. Other members can't use their phone. So it's a whole big example of trying to explain a complicated issue to Capitol Hill. And what we'll see over the course of the next month is all of these members sort out their requests of this process, and maybe we'll have a budget towards the end of March or the beginning part of April. And so then you'll see a whole round of agency heads go through the process of explaining their budget request to Capitol Hill. And, those of us who advocate on this real actively will be submitting questions. If you have a question to ask the NSF director, send it to Dell and I's attention, or anybody on this call. We're definitely going to round up some questions for that, which may happen in the next several weeks. So, that's what you're going to see a lot of in the next 2 months, are rumors and discussions about where the spending process is going to go. Because, as I mentioned, Congress wants to get out of here and go back and campaign in their districts. So you're going to see a lot of that stuff unfold a little bit earlier this year.
So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some advocacy opportunities for you and others who care about these issues. We sort of throw around a lot of terms on these calls that maybe you're not familiar with. And I see that Anita and others are posting in the chat some direction on what Congress is looking to do in the next few weeks, but it's worth explaining what the difference is between these different terms. So programmatic requests on Capitol Hill refer to the ability of a member of Congress to convey to appropriators his or her desire for a certain program to remain funded, to have increases in funding. And we have heard from staff and others that offices value hearing from constituents on the importance of federal programs and the money that's invested in them. So, for example, if you are a fan of Title II Part A, which is the money that's invested in professional development for teachers, it gets sent to states and states decide how to spend it. You should consider letting your congressional delegation know that. And then the folks who work in those offices will let their bosses know, hey, we're hearing from our constituents that Title II is important to our district, to the folks that we represent. They would recommend to their boss, you should really let the Appropriations Committee know that that's important to you. We're hearing that this is an increasingly important campaign for members of Congress in the appropriations process. So the guidance that Anita's been posting links to, and I'm sure Jenny will send out after this call, will point you to how to do that. If you don't know what report language is language that accompanies spending bills that delineates Congress's guidance to the agencies on how they would like to see those programs operate, if they should have any priorities. For example, the Education and Innovation and Research Program for the last 5 or 6 years had a STEM priority in it at the request of Congress. So you will see in the guidance that's being shared with you an opportunity to submit recommendations like that via staff. Staff will be the guardians on those sorts of requests. And then we talked about earmarks. Earmarks have sort of gotten a resurgence on Capitol Hill. There were a fair number of earmarks in this most recent cycle that supported STEM education organizations, facilities, et cetera. Members of Congress are more open than they have been in years past to these sorts of requests, and they will work with constituents whose requests they find worthy of federal dollars to shepherd them through the process. If you have a great idea on how STEM education can be buoyed by federal dollars with the help of a member of Congress or your senators, that's something to consider as well.
Del, I'll just add, a good example of this is for those of you who follow the National Science Foundation in some detail. One of the report language requests that our coalition made this last year was to preserve the STEM directorate at the National Science Foundation and keep it intact as Congress authorized it. And that was sort of hotly debated as there were plans within the NSF to reorganize that directorate and divide up its functions amongst the other parts of the foundation. And that's something that we persuaded a bipartisan majority on the Appropriations Committee to support. And that's part of the reason why the STEM directorate is still intact at the department. That's something that's got broad support and we're very proud of. So these things can happen.
Yes. And I'll just add another good example was language in that bill that reiterated the importance of the broadening participation functions at the National Science Foundation, and report language put in the bill at the behest of a number of bipartisan members of Congress in that bill. So these things can be important and impactful. Here are just a few other things that are going on across the federal agencies. If you haven't already seen it, the Labor Department put out an AI literacy framework. It's meant to provide a foundation for nationwide AI literacy efforts for workforce and education systems. If you've looked at the document, it's pretty, it's digestible, I guess I would say, from which is not always the case from a federal agency document, but interesting to read. As James mentioned and Anita put in the chat as well, the Education and Workforce Committee continues to hold a series of AI hearings. There was one specific to education a couple weeks ago. There was one this week more related to workforce issues. These have really hosted interesting and thought-provoking conversations around AI and its intersection with federal policy. The National STEM Week Act, which has been a piece of legislation that's been out there for a while, did successfully pass the Senate recently and is awaiting House action. If that's something that's important to you, you might want to weigh in with your House member to convey that desire. Over at the Department of Education, there have been a number of recommendations on what to do with the Institute of Education of Sciences. You might recall that at the beginning of last year, that agencies saw significant reductions in its staff. It's where NAEP is, other education and research that we find interesting and important to knowing what's going on in our classrooms and on campuses. The Department of Education has put out a press release on what's sort of next for them. They do see growing what is now a skeletal staff over there in the near to medium term future, but probably not on the scale as the agency existed before the Trump administration. But if that's something that's important to you, you might want to look at those recommendations. We've all been talking about the National Science Foundation. I saw some comments in the chat about what is going over there and what we think we know. There was a National Science Board meeting recently where members of that board were told of the need to hire staff, what we've talked about, that there's some staffing issues over at the agency, but also the need to consolidate or reduce the number of solicitations that come from the foundation. And they've said that they'd like to go as far as having that number, which is an interesting place to be, given that they haven't really in this last appropriation cycle seen significant reductions in their appropriations. So it seems that they're in this conundrum of having a fair amount of money to invest in research, STEM education, other initiatives, and not the staff or sort of the established processes for doing that. So I think, to James's point, the confirmation hearing for Mr. O'Neill will be particularly interesting and important, hopefully, for those of us in the STEM education advocacy world to get a better idea of what's going on at the foundation. I suspect James has other thoughts on this point as well.
Well, Della, one of the things that I know the administration has contemplated from the Office of Science and Technology Policy and others that are in the sort of NSF chain of command is making larger bets on bigger scientific issues in general. And I think, one of the things we may well see are, in the same way that the regional innovation engines and the regional engines grants for educational institutions have started to get pretty big, you could see some of the grants from the educational part of NSF also get bigger and perhaps less frequent. And I think that's definitely going to be a subject that Congress will ask closely about in those confirmation hearings.
And then lastly, if you haven't seen it, NASA has been doing some interesting work and has published a funding opportunity around an aerospace skilled technical workforce, and those hubs. Interesting to see that the agency continues to sort of tweak its investments in workforce development and education, and some opportunities may be there for this audience as well.
Well, and Della, I'll just mention while we're on NASA that, another win for the community that I see very clearly is there was a NASA STEM engagement office that was proposed for elimination by the administration. And that's another example of advocacy from our community, retaining that function at NASA.
Yeah. And for those of you following the chat, Bob Russell, who knows more about the National Science Foundation than certainly I do, and many others, he references it that there were probably a fair number of proposals submitted in the last calendar year that are sort of sitting there waiting for yes or no's, and that there could be a rush of yeses in coming months to those proposals sort of sitting there waiting for approval with these dollars out there. Also, I would say that for those of you who maybe are wondering if you have an idea that you think is good for NSF funding, and don't know if it fits into a specific program, or, now that they've collapsed these STEM education programs into one pot, does it really fit there? Should I wait to see if ASL and iTest and other programs become themselves again? Folks that we've talked to at the foundation in recent weeks have said, look, and this has always been the case, but they seem to be really pushing this concept right now. If you have an idea that you think is worth federal dollars and is, a good investment of taxpayer money, go ahead and write it up and get it in front of somebody, and you have a fair shot at getting those concepts funded in this environment as well.
We'll go ahead and move into question and answer. We have a few kind of focused on back to NSF funding. So do you have any insights regarding how NSF might implement spending the dollar amount they had received for informal STEM for fiscal year 26 now that ASL is combined into other programs as well?
So I think we both sort of have talked around this because we don't really know, and I'm not sure who does. We saw that collapsing of those programs into that $30 million pot. There are, I think, some folks that want to see those programs separated out again. I'm not sure that will happen, but I'm not sure that it won't. I think that those are still questions without answers, unless, James, you know differently.
No, I think that's right, Della. I think, again, a lot of these questions we'll have some light on them during the confirmation process for the new NSF director, because one of the things to note is NSF is an agency that operates under the so-called Organic Act, which allows the agency a lot of discretion in how it manages its programs. That's intended to allow NSF to be flexible and able to react to changing science and technology trends. And so that discretion is ultimately vested in the NSF director and in that person's chain of command. So I think a lot of this will be focused on during the confirmation processes, because it's clear that NSF, I mean, if you look, there are websites where you can track NSF spending. NSF spent most of their budget for the prior fiscal year, notwithstanding all the disruptions that happen inside that agency. So, it's a safe bet that they will spend what they've been appropriated, but with lots of tailoring and nuance to the administration's priorities.
So we'll all try to pay attention and stay aware of how things are changing. Another question, have you heard any rumblings about decreased K-12 STEM funding through the Department of Defense?
That's a James question.
So I'll take that one. So, one of the things that happened with the budget cycle this year was, and this was especially true at the Department of Defense, was the administration took the position that until Congress passes a budget, its budget request was the guidance they were going to operate under for a whole variety of different spending programs. And so a number of educational efforts at the Department of Defense, were held up or paused. And that got perceived by many groups as being canceled when, in fact, they were waiting for a new budget in many instances. So we've talked to a number of associations that have gotten funding notices almost right after the passage of the appropriations bill back in January, where something they were waiting on for 8 months had finally come through. And I think, it's a TBD for a lot of these things, because the Defense Department takes time to evaluate congressional legislation and sort through all the different congressionally directed spending requests. But for the most part, you're going to see if it was appropriated by Congress, it's going to be administered by the agency on some timeline.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Real quick, I didn't see any other specific questions coming through in the chat, but did want to let you all know, just a reminder, join our STEM advocacy platform, because you can connect with people like you're already doing in the chat here, which is wonderful, and that's what we want more of. And we'll also be putting out a blog focused more on what James and Della talked about regarding applying for earmarks and how that's an opportunity for potential funding and advocacy. If it's too late this year, you can definitely do it for next year. So be on the lookout for that blog. And then also I wanted to make you aware of an upcoming opportunity for advocacy happening this Friday. March 6th is when we're going to be trying to get so many people to advocate for after school to their representatives in Congress. And so we'll share a link in the chat providing information on how you can do this. And it's just a day for you to reach out to Congress and let them know you want them to increase funding for after school. And we have in the link that we'll share, there's information about what's considered lobbying, what's not considered lobbying, and it's just pure education and advocacy. But if you have any questions about that, feel free to send us an email at stemhub@afterschoolalliance.org. And then we look forward to connecting with you in the STEM advocacy platform as well.
Thank you for joining us for this insightful discussion on the policy landscape affecting STEM education and workforce development. We hope you've gained valuable perspectives and actionable strategies from our conversations. We'll continue this important dialogue with critical insights about top STEM priorities and more guidance on navigating the current advocacy landscape. To learn more about the work of STEM Education Coalition, After School STEM Hub, and STEM ecosystems, please visit our websites. Until next time, keep advocating for a strong STEM education and workforce nationwide.